The rain fell relentlessly on the morning of October 25th, 1415, turning the freshly plowed fields of northern France into a churning sea of thick, clinging clay. In the dim gray light of dawn, a small, exhausted force of Englishmen found themselves trapped, their backs against the walls of the village of Mason Cells, staring out across a narrow, muddy tract of land at an enemy that seemed to blot out the horizon. This was the stage for one of the most astonishing military upsets in human history, a moment where the very nature of medieval warfare was shattered and rewritten. We are looking at the Battle of Agincourt 1415, tactics and historical context, a clash that is not just a story of arrows and armor, but a brutal collision of politics, psychology, and the desperate struggle for survival. To understand the sheer weight of this moment, we must first pull back the lens of time and understand the world these men inhabited. Europe was a landscape fractured by feudal loyalties and scarred by the relentless drain of the 100 Years' War. This was not a continuous fight, but a series of bloody conflicts between the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of France, rooted in a complex web of dynastic claims that stretched back generations. The English king, Henry V, was a young man of just 28, but he carried the heavy mantle of a warrior lineage. He believed, with a fervor that bordered on obsession, that he was the rightful heir to the French throne, a claim inherited through his ancestor Edward III. But this war was about more than just lineage. It was about legitimacy, honor, and the unification of a fractured realm. Henry had landed in France with a grand vision of conquest, but the reality of medieval warfare had quickly set in. His campaign began with the siege of the port town of Harfleur, a grueling ordeal that lasted over a month. While Henry eventually secured the town, the victory came at a terrible cost. The siege had dragged on too long, eating away the precious summer months. As autumn approached, the damp, chilling winds began to blow, and with them came the silent, invisible killer of the age, dysentery. This disease ravaged the English camp, killing thousands of Henry's best soldiers and weakening the rest. The English army, once a proud invasion force, was now a shadow of its former self-starving, sick, and vastly outnumbered. Henry made the calculated decision to march his battered troops to the English-held port of Calais, a distance of about 200 kilometers. It was meant to be a show of defiance, a statement that he could still move freely through French lands, but it was a risk that bordered on madness. Across the field, the French forces represented the pinnacle of medieval chivalric power and military might. The French army was colossal, numbering perhaps 30,000 men compared to Henry's mere 6,000. Among the French ranks were the greatest nobles of the realm, adorned in the finest plate armor money could buy, commanding thousands of heavily armored knights and men-at-arms. To the French, the English were not a formidable adversary. They were a rabble of starving thieves trapped in a corner. The French commanders were so confident in their superior numbers that they argued amongst themselves over who would have the honor of capturing the English king, viewing the upcoming battle not as a fight, but as a glorified hunt. This arrogance, born from a rigid social structure and a belief in the invincibility of the mounted knight, would prove to be their greatest tactical blind spot. The historical context of this battle is deeply rooted in the code of chivalry, a set of ideals that governed the behavior of the aristocratic warrior class. Chivalry emphasized courage, honor, and courtesy, but in the context of Agincourt, it became a lethal shackle. The French knights were eager to prove their valor and win glory on the battlefield, and this desire for personal glory overrode the need for cohesive tactical discipline. They viewed the English tactic of using common-born archers as unchivalrous, almost dishonorable. In their minds, battles were won by the crushing charge of heavy cavalry, the shock impact of men on horseback smashing through enemy lines. They failed to grasp that warfare was evolving, that technology and terrain were shifting the balance of power away from the knight and toward the disciplined infantry and the longbow. As the two armies faced each other on that cold, wet Friday morning, the stage was set for a masterclass in defensive tactics. Henry V, despite his youth, was a brilliant commander who understood his limitations and played to his strengths. He knew his army was too small to fight a conventional battle in the open field, and they were too weak to maneuver. He needed to force the French to come to him, and he needed to do it on ground of his choosing. The field at Agincourt, nestled between two dense woods, was narrow. It was a natural funnel, perfect for an army defending against a superior force. By positioning his men in the narrow gap between the woods of Tremicourt and Agincourt, Henry negated the French advantage in numbers. The French could not outflank him, and they could not bring their thousands of knights to bear all at once. They were forced to crowd together, pressing forward into a kill zone. The condition of the terrain played a critical, often overlooked role in the tactics of the day. The recent rains had transformed the field into a quagmire. The French, eager to engage, spent the night before the battle drinking and celebrating their inevitable victory, a decision that dulled their senses and their judgment. When the morning came, the French knights, clad in 60 pounds of plate armor, saw the English line just a few hundred yards away. The distance was deceptively short. In the past, knights could cover ground quickly, but here, every step was a struggle. The mud sucked at their boots and the hooves of their horses, turning a charge into a slow, trudging slog. This physical exhaustion, before the first blow was even struck, was a devastating tactical blow to the French, a result of their failure to adapt to the environment. Henry's tactical dispositions were simple but effective. He placed his men-at-arms in the center, divided into 3 battles or divisions. On the flanks, he stationed his secret weapon, the English longbowmen. These were not peasants conscripted at random. They were skilled yeomen, trained from childhood to draw the heavy yew bow. The power of the longbow was terrifying. It could launch an arrow with enough force to pierce chainmail and even the joints of plate armor. Henry commanded his archers to sharpen their stakes and hammer them into the ground at an angle in front of their positions. These stakes created a deadly palisade, a barrier that would stop a charging horse dead in its tracks, turning the animal's momentum against it. It was a brilliant tactical adaptation, a way to turn the archers into a fortified anti-cavalry unit. As the battle commenced, the English line remained eerily silent. Henry understood the psychological power of patience. The French, growing impatient and agitated by the English refusal to move, began to advance. The initial French cavalry charge, led by Constable Charles d'Albret and Marshal Jean II Lemengay, was a chaotic affair. The knights thundered toward the English lines, but the mud slowed their pace, and the storm of arrows unleashed by the English archers took a terrible toll. The arrows did not necessarily kill the armored horses, but they caused panic and pain, turning disciplined charges into disorganized mobs. When they reached the English lines, they were met not with a soft target, but with the wall of sharpened stakes. Horses were impaled, riders were thrown, and the momentum of the attack shattered instantly. The surviving French knights, now on foot and mired in the mud, continued to push forward toward the English men-at-arms. This is where the geography of the battlefield turned a tactical advantage into a massacre. The narrow strip of land between the woods became so crowded with French soldiers that they could not lift their arms to wield their weapons effectively. They were pressed together so tightly that those at the front could not fall back, and those at the rear could not see what was happening. They were suffocating in their armor, falling in the mud, and being trampled by their own comrades. The English men-at-arms, fighting in a more disciplined line with better footing, were able to strike with precision. They used shorter weapons, like bills and axes, which were devastating in close combat, hooking and pulling the stumbling French knights to the ground where they could be easily dispatched. Meanwhile, the English archers, having exhausted their initial supply of arrows, did not retreat. Instead, they dropped their bows and joined the melee. Lightly armored and unburdened by the mud, they swarmed the flanks of the bogged-down French mass. This was a terrifying development for the French knights. To be killed by an arrow was one thing. To be hacked down by a commoner with a hammer or a lead maul was a humiliation beyond death. The archers targeted the gaps in the armor, the visors, and the joints, slaughtering the flower of the French nobility. The tactical combination of the defensive stakes, the lethal arrow storm, and the mobility of the infantry in the mud had completely neutralized the French advantage of heavy cavalry and superior numbers. But the battle was not yet over. In a desperate turn of events, a small French force raided the English camp, seemingly to loot the baggage. From his position on the field, King Henry believed this was a full-scale counterattack on his rear. Fearing he was surrounded, he made one of the most controversial decisions of his career. He ordered the execution of the French prisoners he held. In the medieval code, Prisoners were valuable assets, meant to be ransomed for vast sums of money. Killing them was not only a financial loss, but a moral transgression. However, Henry's tactical decision was born of necessity. He could not afford to have thousands of armed prisoners rising up behind him while the battle still raged. He gave the order, and 200 to 300 French nobles were killed. It was a grim, ruthless act that underscored the high stakes of this conflict and the desperation of the English command. As the dust settled and the cries of the wounded faded, the scale of the French defeat became apparent. Thousands of French lay dead on the field, including the constable, the admiral, and the master of the crossbowmen, 3 of the highest-ranking officers in the French army. The soil was literally churned into a bloody mire. In contrast, English losses were miraculously light, perhaps in the low hundreds. It was a victory that defied all logic and probability. The tactics employed by Henry V were not revolutionary in their individual components. The longbow had been used before. Defensive positions were common, but the way he integrated them, adapting to the specific constraints of the terrain and the psychological state of his men, was a stroke of military genius. He had turned the disadvantages of his army into strengths, using the enemy's arrogance and the environment as weapons against them. The aftermath of Agincourt rippled through history, shifting the balance of the 100 Years' War. Henry V returned to England as a hero, his position as king unassailable. The battle gave him the political capital to pursue his claim to the French throne with renewed vigor, eventually leading to the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, which named Henry as the heir to the French king. For the French, Agincourt was a catastrophe that decimated a generation of nobility and exposed the deep flaws in their military system. It shattered the myth of the invincible knight and marked the beginning of the end for the feudal way of war. The battle demonstrated that discipline, strategy, and technological innovation could overcome brute force and social hierarchy. However, the legacy of Agincourt is also a somber reminder of the brutality of the past. It is easy to romanticize the battle as a heroic underdog story, but the reality was a desperate struggle for survival in a sea of mud and blood. The tactics were not just diagrams on a map. They were decisions that led to